If you're into visual novels with an evil mascot character,
That's right! So glad you remembered me! The name's Penelope.
that places kids into a life and death survival game,
Hang on tight, cause you're all going to play a little game of fate for me. Game of fate?
where you can travel across Japan in a cross-country trip, and a game that has a catchy main theme,
Easy, there's no doubt, but you'll never ever be alone. The sun is rising up, 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 up. Come on, now it's time to go.
then you'll get World's End Game. Now, if you're a visual novel fan, you probably heard about this game. The game had initial excitement behind it because it had Kazutaka Kodaka, the creator of the Danganronpa series, and Uchikoshi Kotaro, the creator of both the Zero Escape series and Somnium Files.
I was really excited for this title as it had Kodaka and Uchikoshi. They were both heading this project. And if you are a visual novel fan, they are pretty big in that realm. So naturally from these two, I was expecting an incredible game. A game with an enthralling story, deep plot, awesome characters, banging music, and more. And I was looking forward to the next line of murder mystery visual novels. But unfortunately, my great expectations of this game soon vanished as I kept playing the game. Because while this game is not bad at all, I did feel that this game could have been a lot better. It missed on a lot of potential.
As much as I wanted to put World's End Game up there with Danganronpa and the Zero Escape series, I couldn't do it. The quality of World's End Club doesn't match the other two more iconic franchises. The game does have its good moments, but unfortunately, those good moments were overshadowed by a bit more bad ones. World's End Club had a lot of potential and promise, but fell short in the end. And just as a heads up, you're going to be hearing a lot of comparisons to Danganronpa and the Zero Escape series in this video. So let's break down what went wrong, the game's shining moments, and the game's silver linings. The game starts off with a group of teenagers trapped in a high school setting, very similar to the first Danganronpa. An evil, mysterious creature called Penelope soon appears and forces these kids to play a survival game. Yet this setup was just a TV show that a bunch of kids, called the Go-Getters Club, was watching on their bus while on a field trip. Soon, a meteor crashes in the far distance, with its flash knocking everyone out. And when they wake up, the Go-Getters Club are now trapped in an underground amusement park. The very same Penelope from that TV show soon appears, forces the Go-Getters Club to play a survival game called the Game of Fate.
First thing you all need to figure out is what your task is. Unless you know that, you've got no way of winning this game.
Penelope says that each kid has a wristband with a task that someone else has to do. The first kid that finds out what their task is and finishes it will be deemed the winner. Everyone else will be turned to sludge by a fearsome robot. From its opening, the game has definite Danganronpa and Zero Escape influences, with a more kiddie feel to it. As the mascot character in Penelope, which will remind visual novel fans of Danganronpa favorite Monokuma. It has the wristbands that are instantly familiar to Zero Escape fans, and it has the life and death game that both games are known for. Yet the opening Game of Fate doesn't last long. After this segment, the story switches from a murder mystery survival game to a travel throughout Japan adventure, which I felt was a bait and switch. After this change in genres, the Go-Getters Club discover a post-apocalyptic Japan with no one alive and the kids having to find out what happened. It's an interesting switch in genres that tries to make the game feel different than a murder mystery game, but one that was a bit jarring at the same time. The game's tone is quite different than Uchikoshi and Kodaka's earlier games. While the other titles lean towards more darker and evil themes, of course, this game does have its dark moments, but for the most part, the game's mood is quite cheerful. The Go-Getters Club are a group of 12 kids, and I do think that this game does a good job in depicting young students, as these kids are 6th graders, putting them around 12 years old. They definitely act their age when they do fart jokes, superhero references, and at times, trying to act like adults when they're still kids. The humor is quite funny, and certain characters have great chemistry with one another. When you have kids jabbing at each other like this,
Anyway, leave the rest to me. Ugly weaklings need to stay back.
I'm not ugly. I'm slightly above average.
and then the follow-up,
Are you scared?
Don't joke. If you want to make me laugh, your face is enough.
I'm above average.
it shows that the Go-Getters Club are close friends. I found myself caring about the group as this was one of the game's bright spots. The group oozes cuteness and innocence, and while each of them do fit into the standard cliches at first, such as the kid that's obsessed with baseball and wanting to be the group's leader, the kid that's obsessed with video games, the kid that loves to eat, and the kid that's all about the superheroes, the characters all have their backstories, with some of their plots actually being quite deep. It's easy to have a favorite or two after learning what makes each of them tick, their motivations, and their fears. The kids are heartwarming, and it makes you root for them until the very end. Each member of the Go-Getters Club also has their own superpower. Some of these powers include throwing objects insanely well, curling up into a stone ball, and breathing fire. And these superpowers play a big part in one of the game's 3 sections called Act. And speaking of these sections, much of the game will be traveling through Japan on a map. The traveling theme is something I did enjoy, as it makes you appreciate the various Japanese cities and its history. The characters will often talk about the different regions and what makes them unique. The gameplay is broken down into 3 sections: Story, Camp, and Act. Story is your standard fare for visual novels where there's a lot of talking with text. The game is pretty much all voice acted, with only a few NPCs non-voiced. Camp is where the player can bond with each member and learn more about them, and the Act section is like the platformer of the game. Every so often, the game will branch out in paths, where the Go-Getters Club will split into 2 groups, and you'll have to choose which group that you want to pick and their path that they pursue. Eventually, you do get the option to go back in the timeline and play all the paths to get the true ending. Overall, the game can be broken down to about 60% story, 20% camp, and the final 20% being Act, where the story and camp sections weren't too bad, and the Act section just being unfun.
Now, I don't have too many good things to say about the Act section. They were not enjoyable to play, and it wasn't because the platforming was hard, because it really wasn't. The puzzles were really easy, the general action was easy, the bosses were pretty easy, and I definitely feel that the Act sections could have actually been a lot harder.
For instance, simply moving a box is a lot more difficult than it should be. When you want to move a box to use as a stepping stool, sometimes your character will auto-grab the box or a nearby ledge. This gets annoying, as when you're trying to move a box next to a ledge, it may grab the ledge instead. A better way to prevent this auto-grab might have been to push another button to grab that ledge, or if you had to push a bit harder on the directional control, like pushing up a bit harder for instance. The game's controls also has the delay when jumping and doing actions, as it really feels like you're playing with some slight lag.
I see.
As you can see, there was a bit of a delay when activating my superpower, leading to a death and a game over. This is quite frustrating, as when you're doing anything, it will be delayed anywhere from half a second to a whole second. This includes jumping, turning in the opposite direction, and activating your superpower. This led to a lot of unnecessary deaths, where if there was no delay, I would have dodged the attack or activated my superpower well in advance. And I felt the pain of fighting game players, where if you're playing those games, if it has lag or even off by a few frames, it's the difference between pulling off an insane combo or whiffing entirely. The same thing happens in World's Endgame, where players will often whiff on actions because of this horrible delay, and you'll be getting the game over screen a lot because of this. But that's not all. Collision detection, where you dodge an enemy's attack, but the attack actually stretches out a few more hidden frames and kills the player, is quite frustrating. In fact, any attack will kill the player in one shot, as there's no HP meter during these sections. The Act portion also misses out on some major potential. During each stage, you'll have a group of 3 characters, where you control one of them at a time. Unfortunately, you can't switch between the characters manually, which I think is a big mistake. The game stages are scripted, as the game will automatically select the best character when dealing with an enemy or how to get past an obstacle. The games are laid out and oftentimes spoon feeds the player so much that it's very hard to get stuck or have much difficulty beating these stages. And the stage designs are very simple, with the puzzles being very easy to figure out. What the game should have done is have the ability to switch between any of the party members. Since they each have their own unique superpower, the game would make the player figure out which character they need to use at a given time. Then, the designers could have made more difficult, complex stages. The puzzles could have been a lot harder, making the stages a lot more fun. As it stands right now, the Act portion was not fun at all to play, but since again, they were so short and easy to beat, I blasted through them and got back to the better story and camp parts. Moving on to the art style, it's quite good. The backgrounds are unique and have variety, and the overall layout of the game is colorful and stands out. The art style in many ways reminded me of Danganronpa. The game also had cool transitions in the form of comic strips when major events happened throughout the story. The music has some bangers, such as the game's theme song. The normal songs throughout the game also fit each section quite well. But despite the game's beautiful graphics and catchy tunes, they were not enough to hide the many blemishes that the game had. So what went wrong?
From watching the trailers of the game to just the opening of the game itself, the game wanted to be like a Danganronpa and a Zero Escape series. But I felt that the game failed on both parts because after the first hour, the game ditched a murder mystery-ish life or death situation for this travel across Japan. And while the rest of the game did have that mystery element to it, it could have went a lot harder on it because I felt that it wasn't strong enough. And I felt that's just one of the many flaws that the game had that kept it from being memorable.
The biggest flaw, as mentioned earlier, is the act section. I honestly think that the game would have been a lot better if it ditched this section entirely and went harder on the visual novel aspect. Make the story have a lot more meaningful choices, where the player has to choose one path or another, or pick between dialogue options, and double down on the story and camp sections. The story also had some ridiculous and non-believable parts, even for anime and visual novel standards. There's one part where one of the kids can fly a helicopter, based off playing flight simulators. And there's another part where the same kid drives a train. Other situations like this pop up where it's quite a stretch and frequently goes outside the realm of believability. The game was originally released on mobile devices on the Apple Arcade 6 months before its Nintendo Switch release. It was a demo to see initial impressions of the game's concept, and those initial impressions were not good, with many saying that the game wasn't complete, the game felt off, and the hope that the full game release would be a lot better. Unfortunately, the full game release was more of the same game and didn't live up to its potential. The marketing of the game also didn't do this game any favors. Before the game was called World's End Club, the original Japanese title was Death March Club, a title that felt like an actual killing game with battle royale themes. The game's trailers didn't clearly show what the game was about. As mentioned earlier, it was a game about the game of fate during the beginning, where the kids were all pitted in a life or death situation. The marketing clearly pointed towards a Danganronpa and Zero Escape story, yet it ended up becoming a more lighthearted game traveling throughout Japan. It also wasn't clear if the game would be more of a platformer or mostly a visual novel game with platforming on the side.
Now, a game could have its fair share of flaws if the story is excellent. So since the story was just okay-ish to me, the flaws came out in full force. I couldn't ignore them.
For one, the game uses a lot of story dumps, where the big reveals are dropped in one long setting without any build-up or hints beforehand. If you contrast this to great stories, they build up to the grand reveals and have the players thinking about what's going to happen next. Yet this game didn't really do that. It didn't really have that build-up. Instead of the story's progression flowing naturally, it was quite the opposite in this game. The game also relies on a slew of twists during the end of the game. Now, having a lot of twists, if used properly and given a build-up, isn't bad, yet the game forced so many of these many twists that when it was finally revealed, they weren't that impactful. The story also gets quite ridiculous, even for visual novel and anime standards. During parts of the story, I thought certain sections were so random it wouldn't be plausible. There were chunks of the story that weren't written well, as certain reveals were shoehorned in just to answer questions.
Now, despite World Endgame's flaws, there are some silver linings. For Tokyo Game's second title, the creators are willing to try something new. They're not afraid to experiment and go outside of their more established franchises. And I felt that if this game was a lot better executed and had a better direction, this game would have been a memorable game to play.
For all of its flaws, I did enjoy the game more than I disliked it. And I know that's not a ringing endorsement of this game, and yeah, that is true, as I call games as I see it. I think I expected a lot more from this game since it's headed by Kodaka and Uchikoshi. And by doing that, it set myself up for some major disappointment. If you come into World's End Club without the grand expectations of an incredible battle royale or an engrossing murder mystery visual novel, then the game becomes a lot more tolerable. Throughout my 18-hour adventure, I saw some good in the game. The art style, the voice acting in both Japanese and English, and the characters were all well done. The Go-Getters Club were pretty cool to play. Even though this game wasn't the big hit that we were all expecting, visual novel fans will still keep tabs on Tokyo Games because of its creators, Kodaka and Uchikoshi. Yet I keep thinking that the game had a lot more potential, but could never live up to the two games that it was chasing. The game tried to do too much and didn't pay off, and the platform section definitely fell flat. If World's Endgame was streamlined to be more of a visual novel, take out the platforming section, and go harder on the murder mystery and investigative themes, and keep the player on edge, the game would have been a lot better. But I do think, despite the game not living up to our expectations, that Tokyo Games can build on the good of this game, can learn from their mistakes, and make a much better game in the future.
So thank you for watching this video, and I'd love to know your take in the comments below. And as always, I'll see you in the next video. Take it easy, everyone.